Over at Parliament House, Chief Justice Henry Alcock and Lieutenant Governor Peter Hunter were very concerned. They worried that a trial held at York would mean the hanging of a Mississauga man at the home district jail with all of his family members camped over there at Gibraltar Point. British settlers in the town and surrounding area were still very sensitive to the idea of violence by the indigenous people of the province. Several alarms had come up over the last several years suggesting that the indigenous people were ready to rise up and massacre the whites. These were all just lies meant to stoke fears and poison relationships. But it was part of the public discourse, and the leadership was anxious to avoid trouble. They wanted nothing to do with the hanging of Ogatonacot at the home district jail at York. They were also mindful of the policy that came from their bosses in London. They were expected to maintain a delicate balance. On the one hand, more settlers were encouraged to come into Upper Canada to build up a population base that would act as a deterrent to American aggression. On the other hand, the British knew that they would need the continued support of Indigenous warriors in that coming fight with the Americans. As a result, tons of supplies were loaded on ships at Kingston and taken across Lake Ontario and delivered to Indigenous villages all across the province. There was food and clothing and cooking utensils as well as hunting and fishing equipment. All of this largesse by the British was designed to support the strategic necessity of the day, which was to maintain good relations with their Indigenous allies. All of this was complicated by the racial intolerance that was practiced by many of the newcomers. British settlers believed that the land was empty and that it belonged to the King of England, and therefore to them. Conflict was inevitable as new settlers encroached more and more every day on land used by Indigenous people for generations. There were many small events, such as a settler shooting the dog of a Mississauga family or a farmer damaging a fishing weir at the mouth of the river. Any one of these could escalate quickly into a heated situation that might upset the delicate balance. In this context, the murder of John Sharp was one more stress point that could not be allowed to interfere with the broader strategy. The thought process at Parliament House is illustrated by an amazing document found in the archives of Ontario. It is a small note that Chief Justice Henry Alcock wrote to himself. The note is clearly dated at the top, 31st May, 1804. The second line is, went to the governor over the wait for London. Now this has nothing to do with Ogatonacot, but demonstrates the priority of Alcock at this moment. He was dissatisfied with his prospects in York and wished to use his connections in London to gain a better position. He was bugging the governor to clear the way so that he could sail to England at the earliest possible moment. In fact, Alcock would abandon the case of the murder of John Sharp in midstream when he sailed to England at the end of August, leaving the case in the charge of his protege, Judge Thomas Cochrane. The next line says, "The Indian taken." This demonstrates in the language of the day that Ogatonacot had been arrested and was already in jail as of May 31st. Then he wrote, "Survey of the place where the murder committed." This suggests that they were not clear about the exact location of the murder of John Sharp. Alcock was focusing on a law that said that the murder trial must take place in the courthouse of the county town of the district where the murder took place. This was a sensible law and was easily applied in most situations. However, in the case of the murder of John Sharp, there was a problem. Only 2 years before, Home District, which used to stretch from west of York all the way to the Trent River, was divided in half, creating Newcastle District to the east. The border between Home and Newcastle districts went from the lakeshore near present-day Oshawa across Lake Scugog. Unfortunately, in 1804, only the first 2 concessions had been surveyed, so there was no way to tell which district contained the Farewell Trading Post. This was critical, because the authorities did not want to have the murder trial in York, the county town of Home District. They wanted to have the murder trial in the county town of Newcastle District, which was way off there to the east, the little village of Newcastle on Presqu'île Point. Only a survey of the border between Home and Newcastle District would solve this problem in a way that was legally binding and that nobody could dispute. The last line of Alcock's note to self says that it would do if the survey made in the last of July. Unfortunately, that timing was not achieved, but it is certainly fascinating for us today to see, in his own words, how the Chief Justice was putting plans in motion to survey the border soon after the arrest of Ogatonecut. I bet that the Chief Justice would never imagine that his little scribbled note to self would come to light more than 2 centuries later and allow us into his mind at that moment in 1804. The survey was conducted by John Stegman, one of Upper Canada's most experienced deputy surveyors. When he got back to York after completing his last survey, he was given orders to proceed to Lake Scugog and survey the border between Home and Newcastle districts. He assembled a crew and headed for Whitby Township on August 17th, completed the survey on the 25th, and was back in York on the 27th. On August 29th, Stegman completed the report and the plan and passed his documents on to the General Surveyor's office. We are very lucky to have in the Archives of Ontario both a transcription of those notes produced by the General Surveyor's office and copies of the original pages of the notepad that he used during the survey. The notes suggest a man who was meticulous about his work but never had enough time. Nothing fancy, just the facts. The anticipated information was contained in the covering letter of Stegman's report. It said, "The exact and positive situation of the house of Moody Farewell is 7 miles eastward of the division line between the townships of Whitby and Darlington." At the same time, Stegman produced a plan, or a map, which was included with the report. Here's part of that plan. You can see the dark line, which represents the division line between the districts. It extends to the north and meets the western shore of Scugog Island. From that point, there is a dotted line that extends east. This represents a calculation that Stegman made to determine that the house of Moody Farewell was 7 miles east of the borderline, clearly in Newcastle District. The Chief Justice would be happy with this result. It meant that the trial of Ogatonecut would, in fact, be held at Newcastle on Presqu'île Point, and not at York. Mission accomplished. The ships on the Great Lakes were operated by the Provincial Marine, which we can call the British Navy on the Great Lakes. Many of the sailors who worked for the Provincial Marine hailed from the British Navy, but the organization was actually managed by the British Army. Relations were often strained when Army officers were making decisions about ships and sailing. In particular, Army officers looked down on ship captains who had developed wide experience and knowledge for sailing on the lakes. There was a palpable tension between these two very different cultures. One such ship captain was Lieutenant Thomas Paxton. He was valued for his skill as a sailor and a ship captain, but he often bumped up against the authorities who didn't appreciate his tendency to speak his mind. Paxton needed to keep his job to support his family in Kingston, but on occasion he would be frank with his bosses. The ships that were built by the Provincial Marine were constructed of uncured green pine timber, which meant that they rotted quickly, and every winter had to come back to Kingston for a major refit just to keep them operational. On top of that, the 1804 season had been particularly nasty, with many storms and lots of rain, which produced major flooding events along the north shore of Lake Ontario. By the end of September, all the ships of the Provincial Marine were in tough shape, with sails and rigging patched and mended just to get them back to Kingston for their winter refit. It had been a tough season on the lakes. Near the end of September, HMS Speedy was the only ship anchored in York Harbor. Lieutenant Governor Hunter sent a messenger to tell the captain, Lieutenant Thomas Paxton, that he was requested at Parliament House for a meeting. At the meeting, Hunter presented the captain with his orders. Paxton was appalled. How could he be responsible for 20 people and their baggage sailing on Lake Ontario in October when the weather could be unpredictable and dangerous? He refused to sail. Lieutenant Governor Hunter responded by threatening Paxton with court-martial. That was it. Sail the Speedy to Newcastle or go to jail. His wife and kids were clearly in his mind when Paxton relented and agreed to sail the Speedy to Newcastle. But he wouldn't be happy about it. Presqu'île Bay had been identified in the 1790s as an excellent protected harbor where ships sailing between Kingston and York could ride out a storm. Ship captains knew very well that this was a welcome harbor of refuge that could help them avoid disaster. Hopes were high for a town on Presqu'île Point. Investors purchased village lots well before there was a village. Several families settled on Presqu'île Point and earned their living from the constant shipping and transportation on the lake. In 1802, Newcastle District was created, and this fledgling little town was named Newcastle. Better yet, it gained the status of county town. A large 3-story building was constructed to house the courthouse and jail, and a commercial wharf was built nearby. Things were looking rosy for the little town of Newcastle. Charles Selleck was an experienced ship captain, and his father-in-law George Gibson was a skilled ship's carpenter. They had been building ships and transporting people and goods across Lake Ontario for more than a decade, and had settled permanently on Presqu'île Point just 2 years before. They had built the courthouse building and were now its custodians. Selleck had acquired a grant of land on the shoreline, and there the wharf had been built. Newcastle Courthouse had hosted the Fall Assizes in 1803, and now they were getting ready to do it again. But this time would be much more interesting because the docket included a murder trial. That meant that there would be more visitors and more rooms to prepare, and also they would need a lot more rum and whiskey to stock the bar. Also, they were given orders to build the gallows. After all, a hanging seemed almost inevitable. Even though Presqu'île Bay was an effective harbor of refuge, there was a well-known problem. The Middle Ground Shoal was a large, shallow obstacle that dominated the entrance to the bay. Ship captains knew that they needed to sail all the way to the eastern end of the entrance to the bay, then turn sharply west into the old channel. This provided deeper water all the way to Salt Point, a small peninsula near the Newcastle Courthouse. In daylight and good weather, this could be managed, but at night and in bad weather, it was not so easy. In such situations, the Sellecks would build a beacon fire on the eastern shore of Salt Point to help guide the sailors into the bay. A direct channel was dredged into the bay in the 1870s to solve this problem. But in 1804, this complex situation was in the mind of Captain Paxton as he prepared to sail to Newcastle.